Okay, voilà. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to our chairs, thanks to our participants and our attendees. Just to make a quick comment on kind of the culture or the atmosphere that we wanted to have with this this networking event. We want to keep it as warm and helpful and collegial as possible. So hoping to keep it not informal to the extent that you're interrupting each other, but definitely having kind of a nice exchange as best we can, especially in Q&A time. So I've told the chairpersons that they're welcome to allow our presenters to give a brief kind of introduction themselves, especially in case you're wanting to kind of foster connections or explain the new direction that you might be taking your research, or just kind of what you're looking for in terms of scholarly and collegial exchange. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Felicity. Thank you so much, Felicity, for chairing.
Thanks so much, Beth, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be part of this event. So I'm Dr. Felicity Chaplin. I teach French language and culture and European cinema at Monash University. So today I'm chairing a panel with Mary Wiles from Canterbury Christchurch. Her paper is From the Beach to the Bark, Female Coming of Age Film in France and New Zealand. And this will be followed by a paper from Frances Egan, who's at Monash with me. And her paper is titled The Work of Doing Feminisme Intersectionnel. So I'd like to begin by handing over to Mary.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Mary Wiles, and I teach at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. I'm a senior lecturer there and also the head of the English department. I've written on Jacques Rivette. My first book was published with the Contemporary Directors Series by the University of Illinois, and I'm currently working on this paper on coming of age girlhood in films from New Zealand and France. And France is a little bit expansive. You'll see as I begin here that it's actually on Catherine Breillat. So it's more Catherine Breillat and New Zealand films. I'm going to try now and share my screen, if you don't mind, and see how we go with that. There we go. Can everybody see that now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to take an informal approach, but I'm also going to read so I don't overextend my 15-minute time limit. And I'll begin with this. Catherine Breillat's intensive preoccupation with female adolescence, in evidence in both her novels and films, is the inspiration behind this comparative approach to the representation of the coming-of-age girl in France and New Zealand. I measure the director's coming-of-age genre films, Une vraie jeune fille, a real young girl, 1976, 36 Fillettes, 1987, and À ma sœur in 2001, against, now it's not moving here. Oops, now it is. There we go, sorry. Against three New Zealand counterpoints. Rain by Christine Jeffs in 2001, In My Father's Den by Brad McCann in 2004, and Once Were Warriors, directed by Lee Tamahori in 1994, respectively, to show how narratives of female coming of age from dual national cinemas complement and contest each other in the manner in which they address adolescent sexual encounters with adults. Whereas Breillat's films are all set on the southwestern coast of France, the New Zealand films present a composite of topographical identities from the north to the South Island, from rural to urban, from the coast to the central plains. Yet across such dissimilar locations, tropes emerge that Ruth Saxon identifies as central to the Kunstelroman, narratives of female coming of age, which include mother-daughter matrices, mirror reflections, the adolescent girl's exploration of her body, sexual initiation or denial of sex, romantic desire or refusal of romance, and the quandaries of coming of age. Although Breillat's films share much generic common ground with those produced in New Zealand, ultimately her auteur vision radically diverges from that of New Zealand filmmakers. This striking point of difference provides the starting point for the discussion that follows, in which we will restrict our focus here today to Breillat and Jeff's inaugural films, Une vraie jeune fille and Rain, respectively. From the southwestern tip of France to the ragged northeastern edge of New Zealand, from the coastal Land region to the mouth of the Maharangi Peninsula in Northland, Catherine Breillat and Christine Jeffs' Une vraie jeune fille and Rain form a recto-verso configuration shaped by autographical elements common to their eras. Both films are set on beaches that evoke the director's own adolescence. Une vraie jeune fille in the early 60s, when Breillat, born in 1948, traveled through the Land region on holiday, as does her teen protagonist, Alice, and Rain in the 1970s, when Jeffs, who was born in 1963, was a teen like her adolescent heroine, Janie, vacationing at the family's summer batch. Breillat and her protagonist, Alice, confront the pervasive conservative Catholicism of the Pompidou era, with roots in Vichy and post-war Gaullism, and the constraints on the adolescent female body imposed by parents and those in the community. Whereas Jeffs and her protagonist, Janie, belong to the next generation of those born in the 90s, pleasure-seeking in the aftermath of the sexual revolution. The social and cultural dimensions of the girls' stories are different. In both cases, the impact is just as decisive in compelling the girl to chart a distinctive course apart from gender and class norms. Both directors adapted their first films from novels. Breillat's novel Le Super I from 1974 was her source, whereas Jeffs adopted New Zealand writer Kirsty Gunn's first novel, Rain, published in 1994. Both films faced censorship. Confronted with government-imposed financial restrictions on pornographic productions, Breillat's producer suppressed Une vraie jeune fille, concerned it would be classified with an X rating and therefore taxed. Jeffs faced difficulty getting funding from the New Zealand Film Commission for an adaptation focused on the sexual abuse of a 12-year-old girl, forcing her finally to alter the novel's story and structure. Jeffs shifts the novel setting to her home on the sunny exposed coast of the Northland Peninsula, where the character Janie is transformed from innocent prey to a resourceful 13-year-old teen who more closely resembles Breillat's heroine Alice in her determined pursuit of sexual encounters. This crucial shift in the central character and her reconfiguration with an Oedipalized family melodrama were the key concessions that allowed Jeffs' project to proceed, whereas Breillat's auto-adaptation would not be screened theatrically for 24 more years, a difference whose ironic components deserve our attention. Breillat's radical approach to the subject of coming of age that blurred the boundaries between porn and the type of experimental cinema that would come to define cinéma du court was savaged in 1976 at the time of the release of the film by critics and distributors who dismissed the film outright as low-grade porn. In contrast to Breillat, Jeffs adopted a diametrically opposed aesthetic that earned the praise from A.O. Scott from the New York Times for, quote, the gorgeous fluid composition underlined by Neil Finn and Edmund McWilliams' melancholy music. The visual beauty of the film, rather than distracting from the troubling story, makes it more troubling still. While the two directors diverge in their manner of constructing an address to the spectator, their adolescent heroines, 14-year-old Alice and 13-year-old Janie, are precocious and sexually curious, initiating liaison with older men who reciprocate while knowing the girls are minors. And here we see Alice, who pursues sawmill worker Jim, and Janie in the boat, who pursues itinerant Bodie and photographer Katie, who by this point in the film is already her mother's lover. Both films commence with the voiceover narrations of their heroines. Alice Bonnard introduces herself to us while slumped over her seat in a train en route to her summer holidays. She confides in us, initiating a confessional mode of address in which she discloses her lassitude and disaffection. The reflective tone of Alice's voiceover narration continues as the film unfolds to situate moments as recollections, almost as if they were illustrations of excerpts being read to us from her diary, whose grid-lined pages frame the film's opening title sequence. Her rumination on the train to which we are privy is sharply counterposed on her arrival at the depot with that of a female vocalist rendition of a light pop tune. The lyrics speak for Alice. They say, I'm a little girl, I don't know, no, I don't know, how big a girl I am. Only you can tell. Please tell me what you like about me. In contrast, Rain opens with a slow, moody ballad that says, you don't know what I want. You don't see what I got. You can't tell where I am. You don't know what's going on inside. As opposed to the mysterious, impenetrable dimension of adolescence to which the film's opening lyrics allude, the tone of Janie's narration is casual and matter of fact as she recalls from the distant perspective of an older, more mature teen, the sunny seascape where her parents and younger brother Jim, Little, were to spend their final summer holiday together at the family batch. Both Alice and Janie explore their adolescent sexual identities in mirrors. As if performing a striptease, Alice undresses in front of a mirror where a candle ceremoniously burns. A close-up frames her hand as she rubs red ink that she uses to write in her diary onto her vagina and then onto her breasts. The expression on her face reflected in the mirror could be interpreted as sexual arousal, confusion, or fear, for the red ink she applies like children's finger paint to her sexual organs invokes the blood caused by menstruation or the broken hymen mythically associated with the loss of virginity. For Breillat, this scene and the film itself accomplish an exorcism of shame by showing those acts deemed most shameful. Using red ink as a symbol in a solipsistic ritual, Alice is transformed into Breillat's alter ego as she writes herself into a sexual and cultural role that challenges the authority of an oppressive Catholic education to which her mother's accusatory claims of her uselessness and whorishness pay tribute. If the bedroom mirror offers Alice a private ceremonial space that allows her identity to emerge in what Breillat describes as a moment of pure provocation, it offers Janie the shared, deceptively safe space of maternal identification. Seated at her mother's, Kate's, dressing table, Janie measures her own image against that of her mother. She first applies dusting powder and then rifles through her closet to find a brown patterned dress that closely resembles the one her mother wore during the boating outing with Katie. She then eyes Katie's black and white photograph portrait of her mother, which precipitates her interest in compiling a portfolio that will require Katie to take her photo as well. While Kate enables her daughter's identification with her, even encouraging her fun flirtations with boys, she does not suspect that Janie intends to emulate her seduction of Katie. Kate tailors the seams of the floral dress to suit her daughter's maturing fashion sense. This dress later clings to Janie's wet body when she arrives unannounced on Katie's boat to ask him to take her photograph. Katie, having initiated a sexual liaison with Kate on his boat only days earlier, consents to the request, despite being visibly jarred by the circumstances. Just as both Alice and Janie role-play adult sexual identities in mirrored reflections that prefigure their respective coming-of-age journeys, both teens seek solace on the beach when they are neurotic, troubled, or abused. For Alice, the beach represents a fantasy space that offers an alternative to the semi-rural post-industrial landscape that surrounds the Bonar family home. Alice realizes her masochistic sexual fantasies on the beach with the dark, muscular sawmill worker, Jim, whose penetrating gaze replaces that of the tan beachgoer featured in her earlier fantasies. As you can see, it's a vacation fantasy beachscape. For Janie, the beach represents the absolute freedom of childhood, the New Zealand expression of the garden ideal that Carrie Kidd traces back to its emergence in Frances Hodgson Burnett's classic, The Secret Garden, where, quote, the landscape functions as a healer of psychological and physical hurts, and people encountered in the countryside display all the wise rustic characteristics of the semi-pastoral idyll. For Janie, the seascape provides that little bit of paradise, a place where she and her younger brother, Jim, seek solace from the disarray and drama of adult life on display at the family batch. Janie and Jim find consolation in each other and take comfort in the calm of the sea as she teaches Jim to swim. Katie's unexpected appearance on the beach during a swimming lesson represents an implicit threat to the pristine world of childhood. A cut reveals his secretive gaze at the beach, with which we have unknowingly identified and become complicit. In this moment, the beach that had served as a safe haven for the children and the siblings is forever transformed, instead serving as a portent of the momentous events that will follow. Another quiet afternoon at the beach sets the scene for Janie's photo shoot that serves as the pretext for her secret seduction of Katie, whose magnetic allure recalls that of Alice's fantasy lover, Jim. Wearing a sequin top and twirling her mother's silver bangles around her wrist, Janie leaves her younger brother to entertain himself at the water's edge and retires from the beach. An extreme low-angle shot of pine trees dramatically inaugurates Janie's subsequent entrance into an arboreal landscape that pulls her ineluctably away from the world of childhood pleasures associated with the beachscape and into the tumultuous world of adulthood, where she joins Katie. Identified with his camera's perspective, we watch Janie's facial expression as the camera clicks. The power imbalance shifts, however, when Janie abruptly takes the camera from him and demands that he look at her. She then approaches him and gently strokes his shoulder, moving down his arm to his hand. When he half-heartedly attempts to stop her, she tells him not to speak. Their impassioned embrace cuts away to an aestheticized, high-angle black and white shot that culminates with Janie throwing her head back in ecstasy. A low-angle shot of the pine trees soaring above her serves to bookend the sequence. This shot can retrospectively be attributed to Janie, who is then showed lying nude and alone on the forest floor with her legs and arms outstretched, as if her body is afloat in the sea. The oscillation of extreme angles, accompanied by the aestheticized incursion of black and white film, sets off this sequence formally from the rest of the film. Its fantastical ambiance, created by formal strategies, invites us to read the seduction as either an adolescent sexual fantasy that transpires in an alternative world of a fairy tale, or as the emotionally charged end to Janie's intensive pursuit of an adult lover, culminating with sexual intercourse that marks her coming of age. Janie's loss of virginity, whether experienced in fantasy or in the real, is a rite of passage, unexpectedly eclipsed by the tragic loss of her younger brother Jim, whose body she then discovers afterwards on the beach. Unlike the grave handling of the forest seduction in Rain, with the emotional swell of its tragic denouement, the callousness of the routine back and forth negotiations between Alice and Jim on the subject of sexual intercourse displays Breillat's sense of wry farcical humor. Once Jim procures the pill for his would-be lover, the two plan an evening rendezvous, which is ludicrously aborted when he is mistaken for a wild boar and accidentally shot in a booby trap crossing her parents' cornfield. The bizarre spectacle of Jim's corpse lying at the feet of Alice's hysterical mother, dismayed by the prospect of public scandal and financial ruin, may be understood retrospectively as a fantasy framed from within Alice's point of view, when we see her the next morning staring out at the cornfield from her bedroom window. Like a cloistered princess, she has meted out punishment to both her feckless lover and her parents, ruined and disgraced due to their own machinations, rather than their Catholic daughter's pregnancy out of wedlock. When Alice closes the window, the surreal dreamscape seems to vanish, as do the summer holidays. In similar fashion, summer comes to a definitive end for Janie as she watches her dad lock shut the sliding glass doors of the family batch, which had served as the threshold between the delimited, defiled space of the adult world and the endlessly open, pristine horizon of childhood. Janie's uneasy gaze and pensive voiceover bind us to her final journey down the road away from the world of childhood at the film's end. They mirror those of Alice, who, before her departure, packs her diary in which her unspoken words remain intact, as if in utero, designed to find expression in the images of Breillat's subsequent coming-of-age films. And just in conclusion, the rest of this essay, in the rest of it, I will argue that coming of age for contemporary New Zealand girls tends to end in tragedy, whereas the journey of Breillat's coming of age girl concludes at times confrontationally with the image of her empowerment and self-knowledge, as we see here with Alice. A maverick from the outset, Breillat envisioned the coming of age girl differently from her predecessors, announcing in the mid-70s an audacious, if controversial, new approach to the narrative representation of adolescent sexuality. More recent New Zealand filmmakers, such as Christine Jeffs, less concerned than Breillat had been with breaking open familiar moralistic narratives, revisit similar situations to those presented in her films, but are more attentive to the perils and potentially tragic consequences of teen girls seeking out sex with adults or being sexually abused by adults. More attuned to the ethos of the new millennium, perhaps, these New Zealand filmmakers present an ethics of sexuality in consonance with the tenor of the Me Too movement, which Breillat first ignored and later questioned in her desire to avoid representing teenage girls as passive victims. And with that, I will end that. Oh, by the way, this abstract has been accepted for publication in the forthcoming anthology Desire and Consent, which will be edited by Diane Waldman and Maureen Turum. So
Thank
I'm
you
still.
thank you so much, Mary. That's wonderful, and congratulations on the forthcoming chapter. That looks like a fascinating.
I think it'll be a really good
collection.
work overall.
Yeah, and really timely as well.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for such a rich and fascinating paper. I'm just get you to stop sharing your screen, and while you
Alrighty.
so we're going to take questions at the end. So we'll move now to Frances Egan from Monash, like myself, and her paper is titled "The Work of Doing Feminisme Intersectionnel," and I'll leave Frankie to introduce herself.
Thank you, Felicity, and thank you everyone for coming and for that paper, Mary. So many, yeah, it's great to just have this sort of informal space, like you said, Beth, to explore new areas and to sort of think about some of those connections that some of us working in Women in French might have. So I really appreciate that. And I think I started off, so I'm Dr. Frances Egan. I'm a lecturer at Monash, with Felicity. I'm in global studies, but my PhD was in French literature. So I'm sort of navigating the connections and what sort of new spaces come out of that. And my work in global studies teaching is very focused on social change, social movement, social justice. And I've been thinking about that as I continue to research French texts. And I've just sort of gradually found myself looking more and more at feminist movements, but are still sort of thinking about literature. So when I first saw this sort of networking opportunity and wanted to think about what's the next big thing and how can I just be creative and not sort of tie myself down, I was thinking about this great large look at French feminism in all its potential forms and how it's been represented. And obviously that got much, much smaller when I actually came down to think about it. So I'll just share my screen, and I am going to look just at the critical reception of one text to have a think about intersectional feminism in France. So not so much looking at the text itself, but just what's been happening sort of in the media space around it. So let me just share. Okay, so I guess I just wanted to start with what my basic questions are. So I've been thinking about different feminisms in French and Anglophone contexts, and I'm focusing today on intersectional feminism in France, based on what we can learn from contemporary French-Algerian women writers and the reception of their literary work. Today I'm going to focus just on, given the scope, just on the release of Fatima Das's debut novel, La Petite Dernière, released in 2020. And I've done a bit of work on this text before, even in this forum, but I am, as I said, interested in sort of the headlines, the reviews, the interviews around this, for an examination of the work of doing feminisme intersectionnel in France. So I'm interested in this work in a couple of ways. One, in terms of how dominant discourse about feminism in France, which isn't perhaps based in intersectionality, might reframe instances of intersectional resistance and actually highlight certain systems of oppression and obscure others, so that we don't see a critique of French society and those perhaps in positions of power or those who are in the dominant white culture. And even reframe instances of intersectional resistance to position the doer as divisive or destructive. And then I'm thinking about what the value of a transnational approach might be in terms of how we, of how authors are writing or depicting instances of so-called French feminism, but also how we might receive those so that we can see a more heterogeneous mode of resistance and potentially reduce that work that I want to explore for those who are living and doing intersectionality. I don't want to linger on this too long because I don't have much time and a lot of you are probably familiar with this background, but just a very brief background to what I'm thinking about in terms of the place of féminisme intersectionnel in France. So it seems as though we often see a binary setup in terms of popular understandings of French feminism between a sort of universal feminism drawing from French Republican discourse and dominated by white women, and more of an intersectional feminism led largely by women of colour. And obviously the state of things is a lot more complex than that. As this quote by Rokhaya Diallo says, féminisme intersectionnel a toujours existé. And even in very famous French feminists like Simone de Beauvoir, we see attention to intersectional systems of oppression. So it's not that we have two sort of neat camps, but that we see popular discourse around that. And I'm interested in what sort of effects that might have. So I want to look briefly at Fatima Dass's La Petite Dernière. So just a little bit of background. This is her first novel, French Algerian writer's first novel. It's a work of autofiction, and it's a story of navigating multiple identities, including being French and Algerian, or not really either, being from the banlieue, being a Muslim but not a good one, a girl but not really a girl, a lesbian, an asthmatic, the list sort of goes on. And the text received quite a lot of attention in the French press. It was notably endorsed by Virginie Despentes. And what Das does is present herself in her bios as an autrice féministe intersectionnelle. So not common terms, perhaps in France. And she presents intersectionality, as we can see by this quote, as a sort of way to live her identities and to be multiple. So as we can understand Dass's perspective, her multiple identities are something that she's navigating anyway, and taking a sort of approach of intersectional feminism is a way for her to have freedom in that. And it's associated here with fluidity and a questioning of identity categories. It's very much focused on norms and the regulation of identity through ideals which no one really fits. And it's not therefore about fixing categories, but about investigating their connections. And what we see on the other hand of the debate from, for example, Emmanuel Macron, who Das comments on his quote around intersectionality being divisive and destructive when we could all be united, and seeing a similar sort of discourse around a universal feminism which would want everyone to fight together the same fight, and which sees a unity in that and a solidarity, but which can still be exclusionary. So if we look at the media reception of Dass's work, I've picked out a couple of headings, subtitles. Lesbienne et musulmane, this is the first subheading of a review in Tetu. And it's representative of the focus in the reception of Das's work on these two identities in particular. So Das is very clearly navigating a very complex identity, but it tended to be reduced to a work about homosexuality and Islam, with the assumption that these are irreconcilable, that Islam is restrictive and discriminatory, and with an effect of separating Das from mainstream French discourse. So her identity as a French woman is sort of erased, and she is separated from French feminism. Another example is C'est pas la honte que je suis entrée en écriture. And this title of the article in La Libération is a quote from Das, but it's out of context. And Das, in fact, linked this shame to her experience of racial discrimination in French society. And she was sort of talking about the idea that we should shift shame, who should experience it, not that the person who is being discriminated against, but the perpetrator of discrimination. And in this context, it's very closely linked to a discussion of Islam and homosexuality. So we assume that it is about her shame for being a lesbian, a shame inflicted upon her by a traditional culture and a restrictive culture. Another example, l'homosexualité est un péché. And Das does in fact say this, but it was received as divisive, and Das was criticized for being homophobic, when in fact what she wanted to explore in the much longer quote is what it means to be a sinner. That was her real experience, but she was using sin in a sort of critical way, that I'm going to keep on sinning, I am going to keep on seeing women. What does it mean to sort of critique that as a sin? And what does it mean not to speak for everyone else, but to explore my own experience through that? And one more just to consider, this one from Le Soir, la nouvelle révélation de l'autofiction française se revendique comme musulmane pratiquante, mais aussi féministe et lesbienne. And the mais aussi here assumes that feminism is French and Western, and that liberation for women is found in secular French society, when in fact Das draws significantly from an array of different feminist movements and long histories of feminism in Islamic culture, also from French writers like Annie Ernaux, Marguerite Duras, from American society and the idea of intersectionality from Kimberly Crenshaw, from rap, all sorts of things in her transnational approach to feminism. So the sort of overall effect, I'm arguing, is to separate Das from the rest of French society, continue to other her position. And we see this with a lot of different experiences of Franco-Maghrebi women and the mainstream media that sets their struggles apart from the rest of society. And in this sense, she is not able to shift or pluralize modes of doing feminism in France or doing French literature, because she is sort of seen as separate from that and cannot adequately challenge those power structures because of how she is received. So what I'm interested then in is the idea that Das lives transnationally and she lives intersectionality. That's not a choice for her, but her very sort of body and position is in that space. And she finds it easy to talk about her feminism in this way with others in the banlieue, she said, and also with audiences outside of France. She talks about the reception of her work, for example, through the translations in England or in Spain, but she finds it very difficult to do in Paris and in a sort of elite literary context in France. And so what I'm interested in is the fact that we have this sort of transnational feminism in France that already exists, that has long histories, but that isn't necessarily being heard and having an impact because of a sort of national discourse around feminism and underlying assumptions around that. And so I'm interested in how we might be able to use a transnational lens to, in fact, further analyse a so-called French feminism, but not within a national discourse, sort of paradoxically thinking about what we can see around heterogeneity, plurality, different modes of resistance by approaching French feminism not through the French nation. So I'm going to think a little bit more about that in sort of different contexts and with different examples. And yeah, I'm really interested in discussing what other people have done in this space or any sort of ideas and questions. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Frankie, for a wonderful paper and two very different topics, yet I think we can already see some intersections there between them. I'm just thinking of how both papers are kind of adopting a transnational lens, and that's really interesting. I think I've done some work in transnational stardom and transnational cinema, and I think it's a useful approach for us. So we've now got, we said 20 minutes, but should we say 15 minutes of Q&A so that we don't kind of eat into the next panel? Okay, so we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. Would anyone like to open the discussion with a question? Feel free if you'd like to put your questions in the chat as well, but I know this is fairly informal. So. Yes, Mary.
Here. I was just going to say that I really enjoyed the paper, Francis. And also, I was riveted when you put up your quote about shame. And it seems for me, when I was reading the interviews with Brea, that for her, the whole idea of shame is it's sort of a founding moment for her and her representation of women on the screen. And this whole idea that her film in some way should provide an exorcism of shame that we all feel, just not only as, well, as women, first and foremost, before the whole notion of intersectionality really takes hold. For her, interestingly, most of her coming of age girls, the ones I'm looking at, they're all about the same age and they're all white. And most of them are middle class to upper middle class. So interestingly though, of course that most of her work is based on her own life and is deeply autobiographical. And so for her, it's an exorcism of her own shame, the shame she experienced as an adolescent girl, but also then the shame of her characters and that they embody and that they exercise through various ritualistic moments of catharsis. But I don't know how that, I just was riveted by the fact that that was one of the quotes that you selected when you put your quotes up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I find shame fascinating as well. Just that idea that it's, it's silencing the person who, I guess just the power dynamics are so interesting. And that idea that you say of an exorcism of shame, I'm wondering whether that shifts sort of the experience of feeling bad to someone else. Is that shifted sort of to the audience? Is that shifted to who we see as inflicting shame and sort of being responsible for shame? I think that's really interesting, that idea, yeah. I did have a little question for you, Mary, as well. And I think you sort of covered this, but I was really intrigued and wanted to hear more. Just the idea that, and forgive me if I misheard this, but that the more contemporary films that you're looking at are more likely to focus on tragic ends, whereas the film from the 70s was more about some sort of liberation, learning experience, some sort of emancipation. Is that right? Are we seeing more?
I think what I was trying to do is distinguish between Breillat's films in France and the New Zealand corpus of films that I'm looking at. So it's more of a distinction between those two cinemas and their approach to adolescent sexuality rather than a temporal distinction. Whereas, for instance, the ending of this film that we just saw, Vraie Jeune Fille, it ends with her packing up her journal and moving on in life. And so in many ways, it's a testament to her future and her writing, so to speak, and Breillat's, of course, as well, because it was her first film. And then followed on with 36 Fillettes, and then finally À ma sœur. Those films, arguably À ma sœur ends with a tragedy, and of course it's a tragic rape. But at the end of the film, Anaïs gets up, and you'll recall that she turns towards the camera and she defies being defined by that rape. And she says, no, I defy anybody who calls this rape. It's not. And so in many ways, Breillat's films, they might show tragic events or the woman being humiliated and subordinated, like in 36 Fillettes, the scene where, I don't know if you're familiar with that film, there's a scene where the young teenager girl plays this cat and mouse game with this older man, Maurice, who's sort of like a playboy and who's sort of playing her. But at the end of the day, she gathers her resources and loses her virginity her way with a young teenage boy, and in that way gains mastery of the moment. So in some regard, Breillat's film, even though they change dramatically from decade to decade, they all have this message at the end, which is, you might characterize it as provocation. The girls are going to take mastery and provoke, and by doing so, gain agency. Whereas arguably the New Zealand films, for instance, Once Were Warriors ends with rape and suicide of the protagonist. And there isn't any, and In My Father's Den is a less known New Zealand film. It's well known in New Zealand, where again, the young girl dies at the end of the film. So you have in these New Zealand films, and while Janie doesn't die in Rain, her younger brother, the pathos of the ending of the film, which I didn't show visually, but which is quite stunning, is of course when she leaves the forest, she comes out to the beach and finds the body of her 5-year-old brother, who's drowned on the beach. She blames herself for leaving him there, and so you have this tragic. The whole thing is kind of framed tragically with that moment of loss, that this irrevocable loss of her virginity, but also loss of innocence and loss of this family connection and this family tie. So in many ways, I guess my argument overall would be, to some extent, that New Zealand films might be more circumspect in the framing of loss of innocence. They're looking more broadly at what are some of the effects, the broader effects on the family, on the girl, the dangers of involvement with an older man, whereas Breillat was so afraid of showing girls as victims that she would kind of overstate. I mean, even when all of her family dies, Anaïs, and she's raped herself, Anaïs comes out as, I'm going to fight them. I'm going to fight them all, as a provocateur in many ways, a provocatrice, and refuses to be subordinated and victimized. And of course, Breillat's famous stance on the Me Too movement, well known now to most, where she refuses, like as did Catherine Deneuve and many other French literary figures, that kind of subordination, I guess she might call it. Of course, Breillat herself, I don't know if you know, but she's had her own problems in life where she herself was victimized late in life. She did a film about it called Abuse of Weakness, and also a novel where she was actually conned by a very famous con artist, Christophe Rocancourt, who basically cleaned out her bank account. She was conned and she was victimized herself. So I think her stance on the victimization of women, where beforehand she refused to see that at all or to even acknowledge it, whereas when she was victimized herself, I think she's modified her stance a bit since then, where she clearly shows in this film, which stars Isabelle Huppert, as the kind of stroke victim who allows herself to be taken in and just basically played by this very clever younger man who takes her for everything she's worth, financially speaking. Yeah, I don't know if that frames the discussion any better, but it's hard to say anything in 15 minutes, but it gives you an idea of the broader scope of the discussion, which actually should become a little clearer the more that you go into the films.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Mary. Any other questions, Valentina?
I just really enjoyed the discussions. Thank you so much for all these ideas, or some areas that I'm really unfamiliar with, so lots to think about. I was just thinking about Frankie's paper, and I find it very productive that you use, kind of a novel or other literary text to discuss the emerging discussion about not calling it feminism anymore, but feminisms, or and there was a big debate, I think it was last year, I think, on the ABR, the Australian Book Review blog, and various podcasts about switching from feminism to feminisms. So it's also, I was thinking, sometimes I think about our own positionality, for instance, of working from within Australia and our exposure to debates such as this, how it frames our view of this our critical perspective, I guess our own positionality, which also emerges, I think, from Mary's paper when she's, comparing, basically films for such different, locations, but we can see like a common thread sometimes, like for instance, I really liked, Mary, the idea how you insisted on the place, the beach, the region, going out of town as a sort of, there is a new set of rules, probably, a space of different, a different kind of, I don't know, even, impositions, if you want to say that. So I really found the idea of our own positionality here in terms of, geographical, even very, very productive. Just wanted to comment that on both of the papers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Valentina. Francis or Mary, did you want to respond to some of those ideas that Valentina's raised?
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. I think there's some fascinating questions there. And I think positionality is something that I'm always so interested in terms of our own position as researchers and what we decide to focus our attention on and what we sort of select to give value through the academic space when I'm talking about sort of an elite literary space, and then we see those same patterns play out in the academy, I guess, where there are sort of certain voices more than others, certain people who are allowed to be the knower. I was thinking about in my paper that idea that Das wasn't really given position to be, her sort of version of how she wanted to fight oppression was reframed by others, and she wasn't able to sort of dictate those terms. And then thinking about how when we study sort of different people from different positions, when we do that at university, how are we sort of framing their ideas, their lived experience, and what does that mean sort of ethically? The geographical question being just sort of another layer of intrigue. So I'm really fascinated by that, and I'd love to do more work on it, but it seems like a big can of worms at the same time.
Keep going though.
Yeah.
Mary, would you like to respond?
Did Raj have a question? Let's just...
Oh, yes.
Unmute.
If you click, yeah, the unmute button.
Unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mary and Francis, for two fascinating papers. And I had a quick question for you, Francis, on the transnational aspect of Dasa's writing. I was wondering how she was received in Algeria, actually, back in her home country. The literary scene in Algeria tends to be very oriented and very sensitive to novels that are produced by, first generation or second generation Franco-Algerians. And so I was wondering how the press in Algeria or a certain, literary circle in Algeria received her novel.
Thank you so much, Raj. And I think that that's such an important aspect which I haven't given due attention to, and I should have. I've been thinking about that a little bit. So yeah, Das is second generation, born in France, and has a sort of complicated relationship with Algeria because it's very much a part of her family life. But her Arabic, for example, is quite, I think she gets by in Arabic, but her depiction of the character who's sort of based on her, but it's autofiction, needs her sort of mum to translate for her when they go back home. And she feels that real disconnect, as though Algeria is sort of close, but also very far. And I guess that it's something that I've been thinking about, where she's a sort of millennial. She's very young, in her 20s, and she's occupying a very sort of global space, which is dominated as well by American references, pop culture, rap, and she's sort of occupying that space. But I think it would be really interesting to, consider the reception in Algeria, which I haven't done, and which is also a sort of failing of my positionality in terms of I don't speak Arabic. So that's something which would be interesting in terms of how language plays in, because I'm looking at her reception in English translation, because obviously I have access to that world. And she has had quite a large reception in the Anglosphere, but then which sort of pieces we pick out as researchers plays in there as well. But thank you for that.
No, and I mean, even in Algeria, I doubt that that an Arabophone audience, who refuses to speak or learn French due to certain, on very important political grounds, might not read her. But I was just wondering about a small section, which is very vibrant actually, of young Algerians who are Francophone, how they might receive her novel. Because I think it would speak to certain tensions in Algerian society as well, right? Homophobia in Algeria, sort of, yeah.
Thank you for the question, Raj. Beth, you've got your hand up, and I know we've just gone 2 minutes over into the next panel. So
that's all right. We've got a whole hour left for the second panel. So I think if we go to 11, that's totally fine.
Okay,
as long as everyone's okay with time constraints, I think that should be fine. Just an hour for each panel. If we do have time, I don't want it to go too much. I was curious, just in terms of what you're thinking about, Frankie, with you mentioned Emmanuel Macron and how he views intersectionality as divisive and destructive. I find it really interesting. I haven't looked into it much myself, but I'm just wondering whether you have, or whether that kind of would bring something interesting to what you're thinking about. Leila Slimani, as a figure who has achieved a lot of media attention ever since her first text was published. She's been super successful, but she's also, I think, she has a cultural portfolio with Emmanuel Macron or something. And I think she is in some senses an intersexual figure herself, but I think she's also from quite a privileged, she has a privileged background in Morocco, I think. So yeah, I'm just not sure how that would fit into what you're saying. And I just think it would bring an interesting dimension, how she might be considered intersectional, but she might also be considered very Republican at the same time.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Beth. And I think it's interesting a comparison of those two because I recently read Lila Samani's Sex et Mensonge, and she's very much talking about Morocco there and the state of feminism in Morocco rather than situating it in France, whereas Das's writing is very much focused on the French context. But I did actually recently watch a little clip of Leila Slimani when she was put into this position that you're talking about as the Francophonie, some sort of cultural representative. And I just found the clip so interesting because it was on sort of, I think it was like TV5 or something like this. And they asked Leila Slimani what she thought about the Francophonie and brought up that Alain Mabankou, is that, I'm just sort of blanked on his surname, had brought up the problems with colonialism and Francophonie and that ongoing situation, and whether he didn't want to be involved and whether Slimani was sort of putting herself in the colonial power to do so. But what was really interesting is that she had some sort of, nuanced responses to that. And then in the clip immediately following, they got on a student in France with a Chinese background to talk about his French and why he was so interested in the Francophonie. And his responses were, they were things like, what's your favorite French word? Who's a French cultural figure? Who's important to you? That kind of thing. And his word was amour, because Paris is romantic, and his French figure was Victor Hugo, and so I was just thinking it's that element of, okay, everyone can be part of the Francophonie, we have a lot of diversity, but French culture will still be the center. It will not be changed, altered, moved by that. We will have diversity, but no change to the culture. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Beth. Did you want to follow that up? No. Okay. And thanks. Thanks, Frankie. Okay. Well, it's just gone 11, so we might hand over now to, I guess, Beth or Valentina. But thank you again. Please join me in thanking Mary and Francis for two very rich presentations. And again, thank you for the questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Shall I step in, Beth? Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to chair this second section. Before that, I would like just to say that I am connecting today from Camaragai land, and to acknowledge that this is and will always be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respect to the to elder past and present. Yeah, so it is more and more dawning on me the hospitality as my journey to become an Australian citizen is developing while we speak. I am delighted to chair this panel because the two of my greatest passions, poetry and the 19th century, are here combined in the next speakers. And in the spirit of the informality, we just all are going to introduce ourselves in an informal way. So my name is Valentina Gosetti, and I got the great luck of working at UNE with people like Beth here, and to be part of this community with all of you. And the speakers today will be Dr. Mélanie Maillot, who is a lecturer in French, and she at Adelaide, and she will introduce herself. And I had the great privilege to read her absolutely outstanding thesis recently that I'm sure she passed with flying colors. Actually, I know. And then we have Professor Raj Valluri, who will present on her latest book project that I find already very fascinating, and I can't wait to hear more from both of you. So I leave you the floor, Melanie, first, and thank you for being here despite COVID. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Valentina. So my name is Melanie. I've recently started working as a lecturer at Adelaide Uni. I survived my first semester, so So I'm all pretty new to this, and what I'm currently working on and what I'll be talking about today is my book project. So now that I've finished my thesis, I'm trying to turn it into a book. And in my thesis, I was analyzing the expression of existential questions in the work of two poets that I'll talk about in a second. What I'm trying to do with the book is analyze it through the question of meditation and see how poems can be used as tools or spaces that can trigger self-reflection and act as a meditative space. I'll share my screen as well. I will be presenting in French, if that's okay. It tells me here, l'animateur a désactivé le partage d'écran pour les participants.
I just made you co-host. That should work now. Sorry, Melanie.
That's okay. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Yeah, excellent. Ce cri de l'être, écrit André Chédid, son souffle dénude et son verbe nous cherche. Quelle est cette entité asexuée, anonyme et neutre que nous appelons l'être et quelle parole l'exprime? Ces questions apparaissent comme des leitmotifs dans l'œuvre de deux poètes du XXe siècle, la prolifique autrice franco-égyptienne André Chédid et la poète algérienne Jeanne Benguigui, dont l'œuvre reste à ce jour vierge de tout travail critique. Traversées par des tableaux naturels qui inspirent la contemplation, leurs œuvres respectives sont marquées par la préoccupation de l'existence humaine, de son sens et du rapport au réel qui en découle. Les images d'espace visiblement impeuplés, mais grouillant d'une vie secrète, forcément puisées dans l'expérience de vie des deux autrices qui appartiennent à des nations désertiques, ou encore de l'uniformité du fleuve et de l'impassibilité de l'arbre qui incarne un cycle d'extinction et de régénération, traduisent un rapport singulier non seulement au réel, mais aussi à la place du sujet dans sa réalité. À travers une poétique qui relève pratiquement du mysticisme, la relation au monde est reconfigurée pour être perçue plus comme un voyage constant entre les étapes d'une cyclicité plutôt que comme une linéarité intransigeante. Certes, leurs poèmes expriment le souci de la mort et de la condition humaine même, qui est de se diriger vers la mort, mais ils donnent à voir l'intrication de cette trajectoire en lui associant un système de pensée défini philosophiquement et littérairement qui permet d'appréhender de manière infime la tragédie suprême de l'annihilation et l'immensité étourdissante de ce qui la précède. Donc, ces deux principes se trouvent rejoints dans les inquiétudes de Chédid comme personnage de son époque. Elle est née au Caire pendant la révolution contre le colonialisme britannique en 1920 qui transparaissent aussi dans son travail poétique, notamment la guerre civile au Liban, où elle s'installe en 1943 et qui va donner naissance à son recueil cérémonial de la violence en 1976. Pareillement, Benguigui grandit dans une Algérie où le fanion de la Légion, symbole de la guerre coloniale, flotte impudemment au-dessus des têtes, assombrissant la clarté de l'Oranais dans lequel elle trouve ses marques. C'est au contact d'un monde déchiré par la haine que ces deux poètes fleurissent, à mi-distance de la misère et du soleil, pour reprendre l'expression d'un auteur bien connu, Camus, qui est lui aussi issu du bassin méditerranéen et qui a aussi été saisi par les terreurs de la guerre. C'est une position d'entre-deux et l'ouverture d'un espace intervallaire qui sous-tend la définition de ce qu'on nomme le neutre, entendu comme prémisse à l'expression d'une relation authentique à l'événement. Puisque l'histoire connaît une multiplicité de versions, la lecture de la poésie comme art tiré des marécages de l'événement, c'est une citation de Chédid, offre une vision alternative et justement antithétique du réel. En rejetant l'adoption de toute position sédentaire, le poème se saisit comme une source de connaissances qui ne nie ni l'ombre qui se cache derrière la lumière, ni le néant qui guette la plénitude. L'émergence d'une écriture du neutre, en suspension entre des pôles qui s'opposent, et sa propension à cheminer vers la question de l'être sont des considérations récurrentes chez Benguigui et chez Chédid, qui se rejoignent par ailleurs dans leur approche du langage ambigu et multidimensionnel, ainsi que les modalités littéraires choisies pour déployer ces réflexions. L'évidence d'une sensibilité très proche qui apparaît notamment dans le vocabulaire, dans les tournures de phrases, le travail sur les sonorités, l'originalité des images, mais aussi l'aspect formel des poèmes, la typographie, la longueur ou même la structure, pousserait aisément un lecteur non expert à les confondre. J'aimerais particulièrement me concentrer aujourd'hui sur la parole poétique et la posture méditative, ce qu'elles partagent. Pour Jean-Yves Masson, Pour Jean-Yves Masson, la poésie est devenue un réel objet culturel, donc à la manière d'un artefact qu'on laisse derrière une vitrine à l'intérieur d'un musée. Et elle est sortie de tout usage pragmatique et mis à distance. Comme il le fait remarquer, je cite, « On ne peut se faire de la poésie une idée purement technicienne. Cette idée se lit comme une injonction à rendre la poésie son titre d'expérience en l'ancrant à nouveau dans le réel, en faisant l'effort de la concevoir comme art intuitif, vérace dans son expression, et qui fait appel à une connaissance dont on fait le procès en Occident parce qu'elle ne se rallie pas à la logique ou à la raison raisonnante. Telle a été l'ambition d'ailleurs de certains courants de la philosophie occidentale. Je pense particulièrement à Heidegger, que j'ai étudié dans ma thèse, dans ses réflexions sur l'existence humaine et l'art, ou encore on peut penser à la pensée bouddhiste, qui encourage le développement d'un mode de pensée affranchi. Le dénominateur commun entre ces trois expressions que sont la poésie, la philosophie et la méditation est un mouvement de libération. Elles encouragent toutes trois des pratiques de questionnement et de déconstruction qui donnent accès à une vision et à une compréhension réformée, mais non dogmatique, de l'état du monde. En ce sens, elle reste aussi ancrée dans le réel sans renier le pouvoir de l'abstraction. En réalité, l'abstraction en devient l'outil principal et est amenée à porter plusieurs noms. Le blanc typographique adopte alors vaguement les contours du néant chez Heidegger ou encore de la vacuité bouddhique. C'est dans ce dialogue entre ces pôles de perception, cette acceptation aussi d'une connaissance nouvelle que se situe l'analyse des poèmes de Chédid et de Benguigui, à laquelle je tente de me livrer. Sorry, that's my cat. C'est dans le dialogue, donc il ne s'agit pas de prétendre qu'elles se confondent, mais de voir en quoi leurs mécanismes peuvent être rapprochés. La poésie, comme la méditation, est vécue plus qu'elle n'est lue. Elle parle sans exigence. En ce sens, elle fait appel à une forme de connaissance qui réside au-delà de l'intellectualisation de la théorie, en s'ancrant dans l'expérientiel et en remettant en cause l'unique légitimité de la communication, du logicien, de l'argumentaire, du discours, de la démonstration. En particulier dans sa posture méditative, la poésie a pour ambition de rétablir le mythos qui, dans son contexte antique, désigne moins le récit fictif qu'une parole dont le sens importe. Elle redonne de l'importance au fait que la vérité, s'il en existe une, n'est pas tranchée ou calculable et qu'elle maintient une part de mystère qui nous reste impénétrable. Cette vérité ne relève pas du rêve, mais réside bien dans chaque chose qui est. La fleur, l'océan, la nuit, rien de tout cela n'a besoin d'être expliqué. Il trouve au sein du poème une existence indescriptible sous une plume qui ne cherche pas à élucider l'énigme de leur présence, mais de laquelle émane une profondeur quasiment miraculeuse. L'acte de lecture sort ainsi les êtres et les choses des ténèbres dissimulantes, les restaure à la lumière, en éveillant celui qui lit à sa propre présence au monde le temps d'un moment furtif qui s'évanouit aussitôt qu'il est ressenti. La poésie est cessation du bavardage, des voix qu'on entend constamment autour de nous, à la télévision, dans les institutions, sur les réseaux sociaux. Cela ne veut pas dire que le poète échappe à cette condition de l'homme, à vrai dire qui est inévitable dans le monde actuel, mais plutôt comme des funambules à la fois ancrés dans le monde et défiant la gravité, il provoque le frisson d'une confrontation avec l'évidence du réel qui nous est dissimulée et que nous tentons de dissimuler lorsqu'elle s'offre à nous, par exemple lorsqu'on évite l'ennui. Et tel que l'exprimait déjà Rimbaud dans Une saison en enfer, je cite, « La vraie vie est absente, nous ne sommes pas au monde ». Knapp fait remarquer que la poésie de Chédid et, par extension celle de Benguigui, j'ajoute, révèle une couche spécifique de la conscience. Elle déclenche des souvenirs dormants, transformant des formes subliminales à peine reconnaissables en de terrifiantes configurations. J'ai traduit la citation ici. Leur poésie s'ouvre comme une brèche sur l'énigme, le secret, sur des formes inexpérimentées, ce qui provoque cette tension apparaissant sous la forme d'une inquiétude, d'une angoisse face à l'impossibilité et à l'incapacité de définir ou nommer une telle expérience. Et c'est en ce sens qu'on peut également expliquer la récurrence de la mort comme thème. La mort qui vient briser le cours de l'existence nous tire vers l'inconnu, l'intemporalité, l'angoisse, vers un non-être qu'on ne peut pas pleinement concevoir. La poésie est ancrée dans le réel et n'y échappe pas. Elle demande de faire face, d'accepter l'angoisse que crée la confrontation à la réalité. De la même manière, c'est l'objectif de la méditation, qui est surtout en ce moment, c'est très trendy de méditer, faussement perçu comme un instrument du bien-être, demande pourtant de s'accoler à l'incité du monde. Cette confrontation qui, comme la mort elle-même, est vivement refusée, ce qui expliquerait aussi peut-être la réticence à lire de la poésie, au point d'être oubliée, est alors vécue comme une expérience étrange, paradoxalement hors de l'ordinaire, quand bien même elle correspondrait à une connaissance plus authentique du réel. Selon John Stout, le poème chédidien est une ouverture sur l'ailleurs et donc une métamorphose. Et Chédid explique dans un entretien d'ailleurs l'importance de cette métamorphose. La citation assez longue. La métamorphose, c'est une manière de vivre, une sorte de suite de résurrection à l'intérieur de soi. Je crois qu'on traverse tous des moments ou de panique ou des moments de découragement, des moments de déception sur l'humanité. Et puis, il y a cette manière que l'on sent en soi, qui existe en soi, et comme si on portait une fontaine à l'intérieur de soi. J'ai l'impression que l'on porte en soi la possibilité de se métamorphoser, d'une métamorphose intérieure, Cela ne veut pas dire qu'on change complètement, mais je veux dire que c'est une question de temps, de secondes, de minutes, de transformer la minute en quelque chose de plus vivant, de plus vif qui nous porte et nous transporte. La question du soi, de l'être au monde, de la subjectivité intervient forcément. Et ainsi, en tournant le sujet vers sa vie intérieure et sa capacité à évoluer dans une zone en dehors du temps historique, dans un présent absolu, et aussi en dehors du lieu connu de vie. Chédid, dans un poème écrit par exemple « Quant à ma poésie, je pense qu'elle n'a pas de lieu, elle est hors lieu », est encouragée alors la recherche de l'être. Et cette forme d'errance comprise comme métamorphose du moi marque aussi la poésie de Benguigui qui a pour ambition de perdre un petit peu le lecteur. Par exemple, Val, en lisant les poèmes de Benguigui, écrit « Gère dans les plis de ses poèmes à la recherche de la passe qu'elle connaît pour l'avoir atteinte dans son œuvre marquée par le sceau du sacré, mais dont elle feint d'avoir perdu les coordonnées pour tenter de rester ». Et là, ces deux citations de Benguigui, bien qu'irrédiablement d'univers encore si peu de la Terre, dans cette versification faillée, audacieuse, résolument menée, Jeanne Benguigui rappelle que le chaos atemporel est origine et fin à la fois. Ce dialogue avec la finitude passe en partie par le corps chez les deux poètes, où l'écriture poétique représente une expérience corporelle et la poésie elle-même doit être traitée comme présence sensorielle à la manière d'une méditation. Chez Benguigui, cette expérience est liée à la recherche de l'être. Le déchiffrement de soi s'opère à partir du corps de la lettre qui, comme un miroir, renverrait le corps à lui-même. En parallèle, un autre critique, Stamelman, explique que chez Chédid, la poésie touche, voit, respire à travers les gestes des mains, le regard, l'expression du visage, donnant alors accès à une pure altérité du réel, pourtant ancrée dans l'usage des sens. L'altérité et le corps sont donc deux thèmes liés et récurrents chez les deux poètes et qui permettent d'ailleurs de faire le lien à la pratique méditative, où l'expérience faite de son propre corps fait partie d'une appréhension de l'être, de l'existence. Un autre aspect du corps est que sa vérité est inexorable. Il est périssable et cet état des choses est innommable dans aucune langue. Donc on observe le passage également d'altérité à altération. Donc Marquard insiste sur le fait que Chédid, dans son œuvre romanesque, mais ça s'applique également à sa poésie, opère à cet égard une sorte de fuite. Et c'est un point qui s'applique tout aussi bien à la poésie de Benguigui en ce que, je cite, « Le sujet peut connaître une extase particulière en se voyant de l'intérieur dissocié de son corps, hors de soi de l'intérieur, comme il peut arriver en rêve, alors que le rêveur se rêve tout en sachant qu'il se rêve. Ce n'est pas systématiquement, mais occasionnellement de cette façon que Chédid représente le grand passage, sorte de transe, le passage vers l'ailleurs ou l'au-delà. Cette fuite vers un ailleurs permet de connecter le sujet corps au concept d'altérité et la poésie s'offre donc par un élan premier du corps, comme un saut dans l'inaccessible à travers un mode d'être apatride et la célébration du mouvement, de l'exploration qui balance le sujet constamment entre sa propre existence et celle des autres qui l'entourent, offre une réflexion générale sur l'être et sa fin. La connaissance de cet être prend ainsi racine dans l'altérité, elle-même créée dans des instants, des fragments du temps et de l'espace et des moments de suspension qui ramènent au visage premier. Ce visage est symbole d'altérité, mais il ramène également à un être de l'origine, puisqu'il est premier, et il devient source. Bon, j'ai une autre citation, je ne vais pas la lire complètement ici, mais nous pouvons prononcer des mots qui nomment la source. Donc, le sujet doit se porter vers cette source, ce flux originel, pour comprendre l'essentialité de sa condition. Mais ce retour à l'originel ne peut pas être une finalité. on n'obtient pas de satisfaction de ce retour. Il se donne quasiment comme un outil, un état temporaire qui permet d'y voir plus clair et aboutir au retour au monde connu à la fin, comme lorsqu'on sort d'une méditation.
Mélanie, encore une petite minute et puis on doit finaliser.
Oui, j'ai un paragraphe qui me reste. Donc, par conséquent, les poèmes de Chédid et Benguigui ne prétendent pas strictement affirmer une vérité unique et tranchée, mais plutôt questionner les possibilités d'une vérité considérée sous plusieurs angles et de donner à voir le cheminement de son questionnement. Donc, ce sont des espaces qui nuancent les idées et instillent le doute, la non-réponse. La seule vérité possible de l'être, c'est qu'il est insaisissable, tout comme l'instant, tout comme la mort. Chédid écrit, et ta question chemine vers je ne sais quel accord. J'arrive à la fin. Marc Aubert parle d'une conscience de l'être là, qui en réalité rappelle très fortement le Dasein de Heidegger également. Et cela peut désigner l'être au monde, mais aussi un lieu intermédiaire habité par l'être. Par ailleurs, Chédid et Benguigui ont bien conscience des dualités, des contrastes qui entourent constamment l'homme. Présence, absence, vie, mort, dedans, dehors, envers, endroit, ici, ailleurs, passé, avenir. Voilà, donc ce lieu d'altérité semble s'exprimer chez les deux poètes dans l'intervalle de pôles d'opposition qui finalement s'unifient dans ce qu'ils ont d'abstrait, s'apparentant timidement à la pensée bouddhique que j'explore en ce moment. Et je finis juste avec les titres des recueils parce qu'on pourrait presque les mettre tous ensemble pour faire un poème méditatif. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci Mélanie pour cette passionnante communication et aussi cette réflexion très, très lucide. On va beaucoup en discuter, je suis sûre, après. Mais je vais passer maintenant tout de suite à Professor Rajvalluri, who is professor at the University of New Mexico. And I would like to give you the floor so you can say everything about your wonderful, you already know that I will read your book, your wonderful work in progress. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Microphone, yeah.
Thanks. Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Valentina. Thank you for the organizers of this wonderful event. When I mentioned this to my colleague, who's a linguistic, she said, I wish I had thought of it, and she's going to bring this up to some of her colleagues. And thank you so much for doing this. It really represents a kind of, it came at the right time when I felt lost, when I felt isolated. And I hope that this is precisely the kind of jumpstart that it will give me, prove to me that my brain cells are still firing. So with all of that said, what I would like to share with you today is very much work in progress. I felt that I had great control of it 3 years ago. And then in March 2020, I still remember the date, COVID, COVID had hit for a while, but the library shut down and I couldn't get any books through interlibrary loan. And then my life since then has been this sort of, dark hole of service and teaching. And so I hope that by articulating some of these ideas that I will be able to pick up the thread where I left it 3 years ago. So with that said, I would like to read my presentation, if you don't mind, just to make sure that I stick to the 15-minute framework. So the philosopher Jacques Rancière has argued that literature is inherently linked to a politics of democracy and equality because it stages a sensible world in which any type of being is capable of any type of desire, feeling, speech, understanding, and thought. But, he insists, a literature that privileges asubjective, de-individuated and impersonal modes of life cannot found a community based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet, the 19th century offers many examples of novelists who explicitly frame their literary productions as responses to the Republican and revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and who were consistently taken to task for favoring the faceless, the anonymous, the depersonalized, and the inhuman in their writing. To cite a few examples of such novelists, Balzac, Georges Sand, and Flaubert are writers who mark varying degrees of reservation vis-a-vis the democratic egalitarianism promised by the Revolution and the Republic. The Goncourt brothers, for example, seek to reconnect the conscious art and rightful truth of the novel with the great religion of the 18th century, humanité. This is the program that they set out in Germany Lasserteux, for instance, and their famous preface to this novel. Zola declares, for instance, that the Republic will be naturalist or it will not be. Whatever their humanistic sympathies, political affiliations, or aversions, each writer was admonished by their various critics for literary creations that were deemed as monstrous, unnatural, non-human, and unintelligible. These are the sort of, criticisms that are leveled at them constantly. The characters or personages who provoked such objections were for the most part female and always doubled by the nameless, featureless shadow of the people. My book, tentatively titled Singular Universality, The Politics of Impersonality in the 19th Century French Novel, attempts to reconcile an aesthetics of impersonality with the politics of equality and democracy. 5 novels compose its primary objects of analysis. Balzac's Le Curé de Village, published in 1845, Georges Sand's Isidora, 1846, Flaubert's Salammbô, 1862, the Goncourt brothers' Germany Lasserteux, 1865, and Zola's L'Assommoir, 1877. Insisting that literary impersonality remains tied to an idea of the Republic and the community, my book argues that the aesthetics of the impersonal invent forms of subjectivity that are no less political, that is collective, and communal for being singular. That is, they may speak in singular voices, but they are no less collective and communal, is the point that I'm trying to make. And my book seeks to highlight the manner in which the literary text dialogue with the Republican values of liberty, equality, and fraternity in post-revolutionary France. So it attempts to respond to the following questions. What is the link between an aesthetics of impersonality and an ethics and a politics of universalism? Can the awareness that the human subject is not the only measure of this world be reconciled with the universality of the rights of man and citizen that form the cornerstone of revolutionary and post-revolutionary France? What happens to the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity in novelistic texts that place the human on the same level as that of the non-human? How may the Republic be infinitized, that is, extended without limit or without exclusion? And I'm borrowing this term from Jacques Rancière himself. So how may the Republic be extended without limit or exclusion to any subject and anyone who claims a stake within a community of everyone? So my study understands literary impersonality in several ways: as the disappearance of the author or the narrator within the flow of words and images, as the effacement of recognizable traits of humanity, subjectivity, and individuality within the narrative, as the renunciation of fictional elements such as character development, actions, and plot for the fragmentary evocations of sensations and perceptions. It also understands literary impersonality as the accumulation of asubjective details, the blurring of distinction between the human and the inhuman, and the dissolution of a centered, structured point of view, or the play between anonymity and pseudonymy. Agreeing with Jacques Rancière that aesthetic democracy and equality consist in the possibility that any type of experience and sensation may be appropriated and extended by any type of being, I suggest that the Republic may be infinitized through impersonal, de-individuated sensations and perceptions that multiply the capacity of beings deemed inadequate to occupy or inhabit the space-time of a shared humanity. Literature, I argue, democratizes the Republic by mapping points of non-coincidence between normal meanings and functions assigned to bodies and beings, and ways of feeling, sensing, seeing, being, and doing that challenge these normalized functions and meanings. Alternately, the Republic may be politicized through a writing of the self. And here I'm borrowing this notion from Foucault, where a way of writing the self is also a way of, it is a certain mode of autonomy of the self, a way of politicizing the capacities of the body. To reprise the sentence, the Republic may be politicized through a writing of the self, one which undertakes a conscious, deliberate exercise of autonomy and freedom. Each novel, I argue, constructs one or both of these modes of Republican extension or infinitization. Balzac, Sand, Flaubert, the Goncourt brothers, and Zola each inscribed a form of democracy and equality, an idea of the Republic, a poet, or a community in their novels. Across 5 chapters devoted to each author and novel, I tried to show how each writer carries out a form of literary experimentation that multiplies the capacities of ordinary beings by detaching them, however fleetingly, from a pre-given distribution of faculties and abilities. Some perform a writing or a technique of the self, whereby its sensations, perceptions, and feelings undo a given order of community. For example, in Balzac's Le Curé de Village, Véronique Gralin expresses the power of a transgressive desire that deregulates the hierarchical inequalities of patriarchy. Her Christian narrative of confession and expiation constitutes a form of self-writing, a technology of self that affirms the autonomy of her way of being, doing, and desiring. Constantly assimilated to the figure of the artist and the people, the community that she founds inscribes a form of equality that disrupts, if not overturns, the divisional logic of gender and sexuality. Similarly, Georges Sand's Isidora stages a female character very much like Balzac's Véronique Gralin, who undergoes a similar trial of sin, penitence, and redemption. Like Véronique, Isidora displays a dual femininity and a double belonging, associated both with artistic exception and a lowly common. She's both a daughter of the people and an artist who sort of who stands in exception to the people. Here too, Isidora's aesthetics of individual existence which experiments with authenticity and pseudonymy, intimacy and mask, truth and artifice, virtue and vice, gives shape to an alternative community of freedom and equality that stands in opposition to the Rousseauist republic of virtuous citizens. In Salammbô, for example, Flaubert constructs an aesthetics of violence and cruelty that constantly beckons to the shadowy people relegated to the margins of the theater of great deeds and acts. Impersonality and impassibility in Flaubert register the mute, invisible belonging of that which is categorized as inhuman within the realm of the human. Salammbô depicts a sensible world in which the suffering of the faceless, the anonymous, and the non-human communicates as many intensities as the loves and passions of rarefied individuals. And I'm thinking here of what Flaubert says, that the loves and the passions of the Queen of Carthage to him are as important and as equal as the loves and the passions of the daughter of a country doctor or a peasant. The Goncourt brothers, Germany Lacerteux and Zola's L'Assommoir, display characters from the lowliest stations in life, endowed with as much capacity for extracting a leisurely pleasure from a landscape as an aesthete or a flaneur, who are as able to experience a sense of communion and belonging with the world around them as those who occupy a higher social order. In both novels, zones of sensations and affects that interrupt the progression of a plot of physical and moral decay question the attribution of value or non-value to a particular type of being. They undo the logic that ascribes a certain destiny to a form of life along a predetermined grid of possibilities. By bestowing their brutish characters with modes of speech and bearing that are ill-accorded to their normal place and functions, these fictions exhibit a gap between a discourse of disability and the manifestation of a capacity. At other instances, the grotesquely discombobulated gyrations of bodies in public spaces signal the discordant inequality and injustice that is their given lot. The naturalist republics of Germany Lacerteux and L'Assommoir open zones of space-time in which forms of common experience mark both the extension and the limits of Republican democracy. In each of the novels that form part of this study, the twin figures of the woman and the people trace the contours of a political community in which the ideals of equality and fraternity may be infinitized, that is, apprehended, appropriate, and enacted by anyone and everyone. And I will stop.
It was wonderful, Raja. I think that the book is in excellent shape. so there we go. Sent to the press today. No, this was really amazing. I'm intrigued by the idea of infinitize that then you actually explain so well at the end, and we really emerged through the examples that you cited. So I find that a very, very productive idea, and I really never thought about it, and is also like such a wonderful way in general to present the value of novels and literature to people that maybe are not from within literary studies. So Thank you for that. So I don't want to take too much space because I would like to open the floor immediately to questions and comments. And I just can see that although the two papers might seem, different, I actually find a lot of stuff in common, because when we think about impersonality and the neutre, we can find there a lot of, and also one thing that I really liked is actually how you both flipped perspectives, because usually we think about, obviously, the romantic heritage, we think about poetry as a, apex of the expression of the self, but actually Melanie says, we are going beyond that in a sense with this neutre, because it's also, going away from being, and on the other hand, we think about, the novel, we don't really think about it as a complete, especially 19th century novel, as an expression of in itself of impersonality, because we always try to see the gaps, for instance, in realism, in naturalism, or how you can unmask the author or through a certain character or whatever. But actually here we have a very persuasive way in which you've convinced us that actually this is so important on the aesthetic point of view, and it feeds into an ethical kind of conundrum. So yeah, anyone that would like maybe to build on that, or if the speakers have questions for each other on this, I think we could maybe start from there, or whatever else you like.
I have a question for Raj. Thank you so much for your paper. It was really interesting. I just wanted to ask you, can you elaborate a little bit on the idea of the non-human and how it appears in the text? I mean, they're quite big texts that you're working on. But yeah, if you could just elaborate a little bit more, what does the non-human refer to? What types of characters? And
yes. So in terms of the non-human, I was actually thinking about how very often you have characters that suddenly stop doing things, and they just seem to lose themselves in a landscape, in a space, and they give themselves over to affects and sensations that actually create links with small imperceptible things, the movement of a leaf, the way in which sunlight sort of shines on a tree. Sometimes they are very overtly, consciously, by a narrative voice, likened to a beast. We see that in Flaubert. So the most famous example is Un cœur simple, where Félicité is constantly assimilated to a beast, to something that is stupid, that people really can't read her facial expressions. But at the same time, in the way in which she relates to nature, the way in which she's able to express her anguish at death, at loss, the way in which she relates to this parrot, shows a very human side through a relationality with the non-human and the inhuman almost. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by the non-human. This, and I was thinking here actually also of something that Madame Hanska, Balzac's mistress and the love of his life, says to him about Veronique, this very pious Christian character. She says, but you have created a monster. You have created a monster in the desires and the passions that she has, the way in which she looks at a landscape and sort of just dissolves into it, expressing her desire for this guy, etc., etc. So that is also what I mean by the non-human. This, in a very Deleuzian sense, your capacity to create a kind of an assemblage with something that is animal, that is stone, that is mineral. So that's what I mean by the non-human.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions, reflection? I'm sure people are gathering their thoughts because we're really, you know, bringing so much to the table. I'm really excited about this. I was thinking also the idea of non-human in terms of, you know, the clash between rationality and irrationality, because another stereotype that we have is that, you know, the big naturalist writers and realist writers are this master of rationalities, but actually when you analyze their characters, it's all bad, you know, as you say, you know, you find these passions that can be governed. You find, you know, all of these pulsions, even in Zola, you know, obviously, even though he claimed for a république naturaliste, so to speak. Wonderful. So actually, I wanted to connect a bit with Mélanie's paper as well here in terms of these things that you do very well in your analysis of the poems, which is like teasing out that really fine line between, as we're saying here, you know, as you say, the real and the concrete, but also going beyond it through poetic language. And one thing that I'm always conscious about, since we are in a sense mediators as readers of poems, you know, in an English-speaking context, more or less, is also how to translate this, for instance, you know, literally in translation, but also as critics to an audience that is not within the poetic tradition. So this clash that has been debated a lot between, you know, the poetic of, you know, not irrationality, but like of not being concrete enough in the French language, while, you know, if you translate it into English, it has to become more concrete to be understood. So I'm interested in that, whether you reflected upon it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's something that I feel when I switch between English and French as well. But yeah, I mean, there's this tradition already with French poetry that it's seen as this hermetic kind of poetry, and especially, I mean, we think about Mallarmé and all of these. I think with Chédid and Benguigui, as you said, they're finding this balance between talking about things that everyone can relate to and opening spaces within these things that are very ordinary, or that seem very ordinary. And what I said in the paper is that it's lived as a strange experience. Somehow we suddenly see something that we haven't seen before. We look at something differently, which is actually very much like the characters that Raj was talking about. They just stop and they seem to be outside of space, outside of this ordered, expected society, gender roles and roles in society. And I think that's what the poems do. They open an unexpected place that feels strange at first. But what I'm trying to show is that this meditative state actually allows, once we're out of the poem, of the space of the poem again, allows to be more in touch with these things that are reality. Even though they seem strange and they seem unfamiliar, they actually allow us to understand the things around us better.
What a wonderful explanation. I really can see that, actually, and you put it in excellent terms. Wonderful. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry about that, but I agree with you, Valentina. I saw so many echoes and correspondence between your work, Melanie, and some of mine. And so you mentioned Buddhist philosophy, and you're absolutely right, because I mean, just to take the example of Flaubert, and this was a quote that just spoke to me, where he says that he wanted to be, he read a lots of, Buddhist philosophy for his Temptation of Saint Anthony. But at one point in his diaries, he says that he wants to be the Brahma, which is the universal infinite soul in Sanskrit, or nothing at all. Right? But I was wondering, given the two writers that you, the two poets that you are looking at, have you thought about Sufism? Because so much of these, topoi that you mentioned, meditation, ecstasy, the sort of trance that they go into, the sort of quest for a truth that is not immediately available and perceptible, but which is still there and which poetry can reveal. So would Sufism actually be one other way to kind of...
Yeah, I'm writing it down. Thank you. It's interesting because these two writers, putting them together as well, brings a lot of different religious and spiritual discourses, because Benguigui, obviously, she's from Algeria, and she taught in a Muslim school for many years, but she is herself Jewish from a Spanish family. And then obviously Shedid, who was born in Egypt, but in a, I don't even know how we say it in English, Maronite, Christian Maronite, Maronite. I'm not sure how we say it. Une famille chrétienne maronite. And then obviously then they both moved to France and are influenced somehow by a more, kind of Christian Catholic. And they have both read Heidegger and Blanchot, who we know have been influenced by Buddhist thinking and all of that. So there's all these dialogues about spirituality and religion, and all these influences kind of come together. And I mean, I haven't explored Sufism yet, but it sounds like it could be just another way to explore all of these ideas and oppositions as well. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I'm sure there will be a lot and coming even after. Yeah, and what you also said there, Melanie, in terms of the various influences, that's, I find it really fascinating always within poetic language, because obviously there is also a certain influence, all that you mentioned, but also a certain influence of a certain religion within a poetic tradition, in a sense, what you were mentioning before, the Mallarmé with their own, kind of moment, le passage du néant, in a sense that, and all that. So when it's all woven together, it's interesting to see, as you said, different ways of reaching more or less not the same goal, but a similar goal of going beyond the known in a way. So I find it really, really fascinating that you mentioned now. I didn't think about actually the actual different religious influences as well, which add another layer of complexity, I guess, to the analysis. Yeah. And also, the one thing maybe about spirituality, just more in general, because I think that that's also very important in the novels that you are analyzing, Raj. In a sense, the idea of how spirituality sometimes in the 19th century novel, especially toward the end of the century, is almost seen as a way of enhancing one's irrationality rather than an asset, in a sense. So I wonder whether that's linked at all in this idea of the post-revolutionary ideas of the Republic, where rationality was such a big, and in a secular state was such a big kind of push, let's say.
Yeah, I really love the point that you made about rationality and irrationality as sort of one dimension of impersonality. Yeah, you're right. I think that's something that I will definitely think about. I'm thinking also of Huysmans in Arlebourg, where his whole aesthetic. I mean, why go that far? Let's begin with Baudelaire, where his poetics of modernity really are so closely linked to a certain type of spirituality, right? His is a universe without God, you know, but yes, it is an intensely spiritual universe. And I know it sounds so contradictory to say that. His universe is not one that God regulates, but its aesthetics are this, you know, deep spiritual ASFS, you know, I don't know how to say that in English. ASFS, voila. So thank you very much for that. It's something that I will continue to think about. And
we will look forward to reading both of these books, one from Melanie and one from you, in due time. So thank you for this absolute treat, and you know, also the 2 papers that we had this morning. Wonderful morning, and thank you so much for organizing this to the Women in Australia network. Thanks.
I think, Valentina, you've done a wonderful job of wrapping up for us. I was just going to kind of, just thank everyone very much for the 4 fascinating papers, 2 great chairpersons. And I think the goal of achieving a sort of informal collegial atmosphere has definitely been achieved. I think we can see that this is a sort of event that would be wonderful to do again. And thank you all so much for your participation and for creating that lovely warm atmosphere. And I'd just like to very much acknowledge too the wonderful committee, Women in French Australia. Beth, who we have today, is absolutely amazing. And also our committee members based in the UK who kind of looked after the UK version yesterday, Christy Margrave, Françoise Campbell, and Natalie Edwards and Chris Hogarth. So thank you so much, everybody. It was a really wonderful, I was going to say morning, but it's not morning for all of you. Thank you very much. And yeah, we'll hopefully continue to do this kind of thing again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well. Be safe.
Thank you.